a Hyperion, the most useful item in all of Skyblock, which unfortunately got hit very hard by inflation. And that's why today I tried out a bunch of items that can be used as a replacement until you can afford one. A Hyperion is useful for all sorts of different things, so I'm going to test each weapon based on the things it's known for, starting with the Yeti sword. I bought this thing for a cool 107 million coins, but you could probably find cheaper ones if you buy one with the bare minimum. The only things you really need on it are 5 stars for dungeons, costing 1,100 ice essence, the Sapphire Gemstone slot for 20 fine Sapphire Gemstones, and Ultimate-wise 5 is extremely helpful. In the past, I would say a Recombobulator might be worth it, but 13 mil for 25 extra mana is just terrible. I'd also suggest putting some base enchants on it. By the way guys, every single visual and sound effect that you saw I had to download, so, please subscribe, and not just ignore the subscribe, actually do it. Thank you. The first test would be a timed Blade Soul kill, to see the Yeti Sword's DPS capabilities outside of dungeons. An interesting mechanic about the Yeti Sword is that the closer you are to a mob, the more damage it does. This can lead to things like a Yeti Sword doing over 60% more damage than a Hyperion up close. For anybody wanting to get one of these themselves, I recommend also getting an Implosion Belt, since this affects the Yeti Sword. In the end, it takes the Yeti Sword 1 minute and 13 seconds to kill the Blade Soul, as opposed to the 22 seconds of the Hyperion. So for DPS, I'd give it a 5 out of 10. But then you gotta take into consideration that most of this is because of the 1 second cooldown that the Yeti Sword has. And since you can use another weapon during this time, I would bump it up to a 7 out of 10. Next up, dungeons. Now this is where the Yeti Sword truly shines. The Mage class passive will decrease the cooldown of most items, and with a reduced reduction, 45% for me, it makes the Yeti Sword pretty comparable to a Hyperion. The damage is pretty good, and the AoE is pretty good too. The best way to use it I've found is by looking at the floor in F5 and just spamming it whenever you're around mobs. The attack for the Yeti Sword is really strange, and it seems to work fine when I just look at the ground as if it's a Hyperion. If you have Optifine, I would really recommend turning off explosions to see though. Sadly, the Yeti Sword does have some flaws which you should know about. Since every time you right click, you technically block in Minecraft, your movement speed is crazy slow, and in addition to this, since mages have absolutely no HP whatsoever, getting close to mobs in order to do the most damage is tough, even for me. To effectively play Yeti Sword Mage, I recommend investing in speed from either a Max Ore piece instead of Storm, and tunings from Talismans into speed. For health, there's not much you can do besides basics like a Wand of Atonement and a Florid Zombie Sword. For the Yeti Sword, you also have a variety of different pets. Sheep for the most amount of damage and least amount of HP, legendary baby Yeti pet for an in-between of both, and a blue whale for the most EHP but least amount of damage. Dungeons earns it a solid 7 out of 10, since paired with the right stats, it can shred through dungeon clears and boss fights. Overall, this thing is a beast, except for the cooldown. But as a mage in dungeons in floor 6 and maybe floor 7, it's pretty good. In the end, it's your choice, and if you have any questions about this and your setup, I'll try to answer them in the comments, depending on how many I get. Now for a much more known and much more expensive item, the 100 million coin Midas staff. I bought mine for 317 mil, and it's even more expensive now. Most of the time, if you buy your staff from the AH, it should come with at least a recom and Ultimate-wise 5, since this thing costs 500 mana per use without it. Now you know all the tests, so let me just skip to the results. The 100 mil Midas can kill a Blade Soul in just 46 seconds, close to twice as fast as the Yeti Sword, and again the limitations of it are its cooldown, since the Midas staff is one of, if not the best single hit damage item outside of dungeons. But basically, you could just use a different weapon in between the 1 second cooldown per hit for even faster times. It's still a far cry from the 22 seconds of the Hyperion, but it's not bad. Outside of dungeons, this thing is a solid 8 out of 10. It's just a bit sad that it has to have a 1 second cooldown. Now the Midas staff gets even more interesting in dungeons, because yet again, using the Mage passive, we can spam the Midas staff to get similar and sometimes more DPS than a Hyperion. Albeit, the positioning does have to be pretty good, but to be honest, it's not that bad. I would highly recommend only getting a Midas staff if you can use a sheep pet though. The Midas staff eats away at mana, and the 20% reduction from a legendary sheep helps a ton. All of this gives the Midas staff a 9 out of 10 for dungeons. This is however in theory. You see, there's actually a bug right now where the Midas staff in its molten gold blocks arrows. And guess what class is important in every single dungeon floor? Yeah, Archer. Taking this into consideration, I would give it a 7 out of 10. Still good for clearing, but in boss you'll probably need a different weapon. Unless your stats are bad, it's a bit overkill for dungeons, and if you can, wait for Scorpius to roll around before you buy one. Lastly is a combination of items. The Fire Veil Wand and the Fire Fury Staff. You've probably heard of the Fire Veil since it can literally do a third of a Hyperion's damage for 15 million coins, but I'd say the Fire Fury is just as insane. For 1000 mana, which can be reduced to 500 with Ultimate Wise 5, it will basically increase your damage with the Fire Veil by 50%. With both of them, you can kill a Blade Soul in 28 seconds, just 6 seconds slower than a Hyperion. And with a Hyperion and those two combined, not even joking, 7 seconds to kill a Blade Soul. 9 out of 10 for DPS outside of dungeons, since it's cheap as heck, but does require mobs to stand still. But since the Fire Veil and the Fire Fury Wand are both secondary items, you can use something like a Midas Staff, Yeti Sword, or even Aurora Staff, in addition to the Fire Fury and Fire Veil. Like always though, it has its downsides, because you can't even dungeonize it, making it entirely useless in dungeons. There we go, 0 out of 10. In the end, yes, a Hyperion is worth it, but why would you buy a Hyperion when you can do something like buy a Divin's Drill, which I just did.